Hi there, welcome to today's webinar on how to decipher user behavior, a four-step model with Nir Eyal. My name is Chris Purcell. I'm a product marketing manager here at Episerver, and I'm delighted you've actually decided to take our best part of an hour today to join us and discover something I think is going to be really, really useful and really impactful in the way that you do business. I've had the pleasure of listening to one of Nir's presentations before, and there's some really, really useful stuff that we're gonna cover today, and I really think you'll get some really great benefit out of it. Just a couple of housekeeping before we get going. This webinar is being recorded. It will be emailed out to you a couple of days after the event. This is an interactive session. I think we want to get you guys the best possible outcome from giving up this hour of your day. So please ask questions as we go through. Type them into the chat window, and Nir and I will go through and discuss as many of those as we can at the end of the broadcasting. And we want this to be an ongoing discussion. We want you to, as I said, get the most out of these webinars that we're putting on. So use the hashtag EpiLive on social media to talk about it during or after the event, and people can get back to you with questions that you maybe didn't get answered during the session itself. I'm sure a lot of you are very much aware of who Episerver are, but just for those of you that don't, we are a unified content, digital marketing, digital commerce, and smart personalization provider. And we actually have over 9,000 customers around the world through our e-commerce systems, our email marketing, and that smart personalization that I talked about. We actually impact $80 billion a year of omni-channel revenue. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to cover Nir's model on how to decipher user behavior. I'm then going to look at part of that model, the part that looks at action, as in how can you get a user or a visitor to your website to actually create an action in terms of what you want them to do. Right? I'm going to discuss some free strategies of how you can deliver on that action. And then we're going to go through the Q&A that I spoke about after that. So who is Nir? I've probably said his name about 4 or 5 times already. And if you weren't aware, Nir is one of the preeminent people out there in the world who look at human psychology and how that works with technology and business, and how where the three come together. You can make some really great products and solutions that are going to have a positive impact on the world and individuals as well. He's taught at Stanford Graduate School of Business. And if you haven't had a chance to read his book, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, which forms the basis of this presentation here today, but obviously in a lot greater detail, it's a really, really insightful read. So I encourage you to go out and do that. So without further ado, I will hand over to Nir, and we can get this show rolling.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much for joining me today in this presentation. What we're going to look at today is this deeper question of how do we change user behavior, and specifically, how do we get people to keep coming back, to keep interacting with our product or service over time? Because we've all seen that products can have a profound impact on our day-to-day lives, in particular when it comes to these computers that we're all carrying around with us today in our pockets. What I wanted to know several years ago when I started my research was, how do these companies that start off as toys, these nice-to-have companies, these products that people dismissed as features of somebody else's product or service, somehow came to dominate our day-to-day habits? I'm talking about companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp. In the enterprise space, companies like Slack and GitHub and Salesforce. How did these companies touch the lives of hundreds of millions of users and start making hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars in revenue? What we're going to try and understand here today are the patterns that underlie the world's most habit-forming products. If you want to be really good at something, you want to look at the best in the business. Who are the masters of designing user behavior, and what can we learn from them? So the goal of today's workshop is not to teach you how to build a social network or a gaming company. Facebook and YouTube and the gaming companies, they already know these techniques. My goal in doing this work is to help everyone else use the same psychology that gets people to keep checking Facebook to see if they can keep engaging with your product or service, something that I am sure would improve their lives if they would only interact with the product, if they would only take the action that you've designed for them to do. So as mentioned, I wrote this book, Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to go through every example that's in the book. It's a kind of a workbook format in the book as well. There's lots of examples and case studies. But what I want to do with you today is for the next 15, 20 minutes or so, give you a high-level overview so that you understand these 4 fundamental pillars of designing a habit-forming product so that you can use these same techniques in the user experience of your own products and services. So let's dive in with first describing what is this word that we call habit. What does that mean? How do we define this term, habit? Well, a habit is simply an impulse to do a behavior with little or no conscious thought. It's about half of what you do every single day, day in and day out, is done purely out of habit. And I believe that we can use these habits for good. I see so many products and services out there that are built by well-meaning people, by people who are in business to help people improve their lives. But darn it, people aren't using the product. And so that's what I want to help you with. Whether you're in the enterprise space or consumer web, doesn't matter. I'm going to teach you these techniques to use these habits for good. So let's get started with what is the common design pattern that we see among all of these habit-forming products, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Slack, WhatsApp, any of these products, every single one of them has embedded into the UX what's called a hook. A hook is defined as an experience designed to connect your user's problem with your product with enough frequency to form a habit. Let me say that again. Connecting your user's problem with your product with enough frequency to form a habit. And it's through successive cycles through these hooks that customer preferences are shaped, that our tastes are formed, and that these habits take hold. So briefly, let me run you through these 4 basic elements that we see repeated time and time again in these companies' hooks. Every hook starts with a trigger, to an action, to a reward, and finally an investment. So we're going to cover these 4 basic steps. Every hook starts with a trigger. Now, a trigger, there are 2 types of trigger. The first is an external trigger. An external trigger is something in our environment that tells us what to do next with some piece of information. Click here, buy now, play this, a friend through word of mouth telling you about a great new product you should try, all examples of external triggers. Now, we in the product design community, we know all about these external triggers. We design these every day. We interact with them every day. But what turns out to be actually even more important than these external triggers are what's called an internal trigger. An internal trigger is something that tells the user what to do next, but where the information for what to do is stored as a memory or an association inside the user's head. So what we do when we're in a particular place, around certain people, when we're in certain situations, and when we experience certain emotions, prompts us to action, tells us what to do next. Now, the most frequently occurring internal triggers are these emotions, but not just any emotion. They are specifically negative emotions. What we do when we're feeling lonesome or bored or indecisive or confused. When we feel these negative emotions, we look for relief. In fact, it's why we do everything that we do, whether it's interacting with your product, whether it's any human behavior. We only use products and services for one reason and one reason only. And that one reason is to modulate our mood, to feel something different. In fact, we know that the studies have found that people who suffer from depression check email more. Now, why would that be? Why would people suffering from clinical depression check email more? It turns out that people who suffer from clinical depression experience what psychologists call negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the rest of the population. And what are they doing to boost their mood, to be taken out of that negative valence state? They're checking their devices. They're going online. They're looking at email more often than the rest of the population. But of course, we all do this to some extent. Where do we go when we're feeling lonely? Well, we check Facebook. Where do we go when we're feeling uncertain about something? If we don't know the answer before we scan our brains, what do? We're instantly Googling it, of course. And what about when we're feeling bored? Between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there's that big project you don't want to work on. Where you go? You check YouTube. You look at the news. You check stock prices, sports scores, Reddit. all of these products and services cater to this painful internal trigger of boredom. So the lesson here, if we are going to build a habit-forming product, if we're going to build the kind of product that people use because they want to, not because they have to, we have to understand the customer's internal trigger. You have to be able to articulate for me, what pain point are you solving for your customer? What itch are you going to scratch for them? And does it occur with sufficient frequency? We can talk about later in the Q&A, what do you do if you have a product that isn't used frequently enough? That's a big problem, but we can talk about that a little later. But the point here is that if you are going to build a product that people engage with on their own, without relying upon expensive advertising and spammy messaging, you have got to figure out that internal trigger to connect your product's use to. That's the first and most important critical step in the hook model. The next step of the hook is the action phase. Now, the action phase is defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. The simplest thing the user can do to get relief from that psychological discomfort we talked about earlier. So let me show you a few examples of some habit-forming products, and you can see just how simple the key action is. Something as simple as a scroll on Pinterest or a search on Google, or what could be easier and simpler than just pushing the play button on YouTube. These incredibly simple behaviors done in anticipation of an immediate reward, that discomfort will be alleviated. Now, it turns out there's actually a formula to help us design for these singular behaviors. It comes to us from a researcher at Stanford by the name of B.J. Fogg. And Fogg tells us that for any human behavior B, we need three things at the same time. We need the user to have sufficient motivation, sufficient ability, and a trigger must be present. So for any behavior B, you have to have M as motivation, A is ability, and T is the trigger. Now, we talked all about triggers. Let's talk about motivation and ability. Motivation is defined as the energy for action, how much we want to do a particular behavior. And it's an area of consumer psychology that we've been arguing about for a few years now, but fundamentally, Fogg tells us that there are 6 key factors of motivation, because all of us as human beings, we seek pleasure, we avoid pain. We seek hope, we avoid fear. We seek social acceptance, and we avoid social rejection. So every bit of marketing you've ever seen in your life, every television commercial, every radio ad, every banner ad, fundamentally is manipulating one or more of these 6 factors of motivation. Now, there's a lot more to learn about motivation and how to use these levers, but I think actually what's more important when it comes to a digital setting, when it comes to products that we use online, ability is actually more important than motivation. Ability is defined as the capacity to do a particular behavior, how difficult or easy something is to do. Because what we know for years now is that the harder something is to do, the less likely people are to do it. So here again, we have these 6 levers that we can pull on to make a behavior more or less likely to occur based on how much effort it requires, how much time something takes, how much money something costs, how much physical effort is required. Brain cycles, this is a big one when it comes to technology products, because the harder something is to understand, the less likely people are to do that behavior. Social deviance says that we become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And non-routine says that we become more likely to do something simply for the fact that we have done it before in the past. Now, what do we call this? Well, this is called practice, right? The more you do something, the easier it gets, the more likely you are to do it again in the future. So we can actually plot out these 3 different elements on this chart. You can see here we have motivation on the y-axis, and we have ability on the x-axis. And when the user has sufficient motivation, high motivation at the top, low motivation at the bottom, and they have sufficient ability, meaning if something is easy to do, it's over here on the far right. If something is difficult to do, it's on the far left. And for that singular action, when the user has sufficient motivation and sufficient ability, they cross this red threshold. And when the trigger is present, if and only if a trigger is present, the behavior will occur every single time. Online, offline, doesn't matter. We always have to have these 3 basic elements. So if you've designed a beautiful product experience, an amazing website, an unbelievable app, and people aren't doing the intended behavior, it can only be because of one of three reasons. Either they lack motivation, the action is too difficult, they lack ability, or a clear trigger isn't present. And we can talk about this more in the Q&A as well. So the next step of the hook is the reward phase. The reward phase is where the user gets what they came for, where their itch is scratched. And when we talk about rewards, we have to talk about the nucleus accumbens. This is a part of the brain that was first studied by two Canadian researchers by the name of Olds and Milner in the 1940s. And what they discovered was they implanted the brain of lab animals with a tiny electrode that stimulated their nucleus accumbens, and they connected that wire to a little lever that these animals could press on. What they discovered was that these animals wanted to do nothing but stimulate their nucleus accumbens again and again and again. In later experiments done on people, when people were given a little button to press on, and every time they pressed on this button, they would receive an electrical jolt to this part of the brain, they also discovered that they wanted to do nothing but stimulate their nucleus accumbens again and again and again. And in fact, some of the people in these studies had to have the machine forcibly removed from them to get them to stop activating this part of the brain. Now, it turns out we don't need electrodes in people's brains to get them to do things. In fact, your nucleus accumbens is activated every single day whenever we crave something, whenever we desire, whenever we want, whether that is sex or luxury goods, certain chemicals, food, and of course, right there in the center, our technology. All of these things activate the very same part of your brain. Now, for decades, Olds and Milner and much of the psychology community believed that the purpose of the nucleus accumbens was to stimulate pleasure. But we now know that's not exactly the case. Because what we now know is that the nucleus accumbens does not activate pleasure per se. And in fact, the way the brain gets us to act is not about seeking pleasure. It's in fact about the stress of desire. It's about wanting. It's about craving. Because as we can see from these fMRI studies, the nucleus accumbens becomes most active in anticipation of the reward. But when you actually get the thing you want, the thing that's going to make you happy and finally make you feel good, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. So it turns out the way the brain gets us to act is by stimulating this itch that we seek to scratch. And it turns out that there is a way that we can supercharge this stress of desire. What if I could teach you a method for manufacturing desire? I wonder if anybody out there, everyone that's listening, is interested in how can you manufacture desire? Well, I'm doing it to you right now. So you notice when I took that long pause, it was only a couple seconds, and I asked you a question, some of you perked up. Wait, why did he stop talking? What's going on? What's going to happen next? What's the answer? And it turns out that this principle of the unknown, a bit of mystery, is fascinating. It causes us to engage, it causes us to focus, and it is also highly habit forming. It's called a variable reward. This comes out of the classic work of B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning. He took these pigeons, he put them in a little box, and he gave these pigeons a disc to peck at. And every time they would peck at the disc, they would receive a reward, a little food pellet. Now, very quickly, Skinner could train his pigeons to peck at the disc whenever they were hungry. Notice that this experiment did not work unless the pigeons were hungry. They had to have that internal trigger, that need, or else the experiment didn't work. But in this case, if Skinner had hungry pigeons, he could put them in a box and they would reliably peck at the disc to receive a reward. Great, that's called operant conditioning. But then something curious happened. You see, Skinner started to run out of these little food pellets. He didn't have enough of them. And so he couldn't afford to give it to the pigeons every time. He could only give it to them once in a while. And what he observed was that if he gave the pigeons a reinforcement on a variable schedule, they pecked more often at the disc. So sometimes they would peck at the disc, nothing would come out, no reward. The next time they would peck at the disc, they would receive a reward. And what Skinner observed was that the rate of response, the number of times these pigeons pecked at the disc, increased when the reward was given on a variable schedule of reinforcement. Why does this happen? because variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens, creating this desirous response, this wanting reflex. And so in all sorts of products that we use every day, the things that are most engaging, the things that capture your attention most, you will find one or more of these three types of variable rewards. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Let me introduce these to you briefly. Rewards of the tribe are all about the search for social rewards, things that feel good, that come from other people, and have this element